In his book, Here Comes the Sun, Bill McKibben asserts that solar and wind power offer the best path for addressing climate change. He spoke about his book at the Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C.
We are absolutely delighted to be hosting the acclaimed environmentalist Bill McKibben, who's been here a number of times before, and he's back to talk about his new book, Here Comes the Sun, A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization. As a reviewer in The Nation recently put it, no journalist has covered the climate story longer or better than Bill McKibben. In 1989, he published what is often called the first book for a general audience on climate change, The End of Nature. Since then, he's reported from around the world, covering all aspects of the issue: science, economics, politics, ethics. In 2007, he stepped out of his role as a journalist and became an activist, organizing a nationwide environmental campaign under the slogan, Step It Up 2007. The next year, he and his team formed the grassroots climate campaign, 350.org. In 2021, Bill founded another group, Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 80 to work on climate and justice. 60. I have here 60, and I don't know why I said 80. I'm sorry. We have a number of people here from Third Act who I aged them just 20 years. How do you like that? You guys don't look a year over, you know. Now, for years now, too, Bill has taught at Middlebury College in Vermont, and of course, he's continued researching and writing. He's authored 20 books, plus numerous articles for The New Yorker and other publications. He notes at the start of his new book that he's gained a literary reputation for a kind of dark realism, having gone from delivering early warnings about climate dangers to chronicling how those warnings have come true. But now, for the first time, he says, he can see a path forward, and it's one, as he puts it, lit by the sun. He contends the sun's rays, transformed into electricity, might still help humanity to escape the worst of climate change. Recently, he notes civilization crossed a line where the cost of producing energy from the sun dropped below the cost of fossil fuel, and that means a rapid global phase-out of fossil fuels isn't just technically possible, but economically advantageous. And now, of course, as Bill stresses, we're still far from saved. Huge political hurdles remain, especially given the fierce resistance to change from the fossil fuel industry and the Trump administration's antagonism toward anything that smacks of environmental responsibility. But Bill, in his very lucid, illuminating, and thought-provoking book, offers much reason to hope and encourages us all to get behind solar power as the key energy source of the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Brad, thank you very much. What a real pleasure, as always, to be back here. And Brad and Lissa, thank you so much for keeping this institution alive and sound and going. We're really grateful. I'm going to start on a very somber note for a minute. Charlie Kirk was shot and killed giving a talk today. And, you know, I've spent an enormous part of my life giving talks at universities, and including the one where he was shot and killed in Utah today. And it's never, ever occurred to me that someone might come up and just shoot me in the course of it. And we cannot have a society where that happens. In the same way that we shouldn't have a society where we have federal troops patrolling the streets of our big cities either. It's an enormous responsibility that we've all got to figure out how to bring back from every direction the craziness and chaos of our world today. But that was a very, very, very sad and terrible thing that happened. And I'll probably stay in somber mode for just a minute here. Not for long, but for a minute. Because that's my, as Brad says, my normal mode. I've spent my life bumming people out. And it's been very cathartic. There are bad things afoot. The planet is heating in exactly the ways that scientists told us it would 35 and 40 years ago, except a little faster. And we're seeing the results of that now in the most remarkable and horrible ways play out around the world. Play out so often and so frequently that in a sense, I think we're beginning to become almost inured to it. It's hard with all that's happened to remember that in January, large parts of the second largest city in this country burned to the ground. I think about it because my boyhood home of my first memories in Altadena went down on the second day of that fire. But, that's what happens when you get warmer air, you get more evaporation, it holds more water vapor, you get drought, and then you get fire. Up in Vermont, where I live, we've spent the summer sucking smoke from the Canadian wildfires that for the second year out of the last 3 are consuming the boreal forest of the far north. Once that water's evaporated up in the air, it comes down, and it comes down in the tremendous floods that we now almost take for granted as a feature of life on this planet. Right now, while we sit here, there is a terrible one going on in Pakistan. It's not quite as bad as the ones in 2010 or 2022, which were the biggest floods since Noah on this earth, but it's bad enough. There's 4 or 5 million people out of their homes. There are a lot of next year's crop across the breadbasket of that part of the world, the Punjab, waterlogged and dead. And at an even more systemic level, we're now seeing really dangerous and scary things. The jet stream, which derives its power from the temperature differential between the equator and the pole, is now that we've melted much of the pole, now behaving in erratic and unpredictable and scary patterns. Now the Gulf Stream, the great currents of the Atlantic, are beginning to flicker and falter as we pour fresh water off a melting Arctic into the North Atlantic. And in our country, our democracy flickers and falters. It is not the country that any of us thought we lived in for almost our whole lives. It's a very, very different place. So like I would expect many people in this room, I wake up at 3 in the morning more often than not, more often than I'd like to anyway. I'm filled with a kind of worry and sometimes a kind of despair about where we find ourselves, which makes it very odd for me to also be the bearer of good news. In this case, the one big good thing that's simultaneously happening on this planet. It's a thing so big and so good that if we are able to really push it to its limits, it may take some real bite out of both the climate crisis and the crisis of authoritarianism. And that big good thing, obviously, is the sudden, very rapid, and remarkably underappreciated so far surge in renewable energy, energy from the sun and wind, that began about 36 months ago on this Earth. It's the fastest energy transition in history, and it's quite staggering just to kind of look at its outlines. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I've been telling, sort of been reporting the news as I wrote this book, that I had a kind of scoop, and it's fascinating just to outline it a little bit. When we printed a big excerpt in the New Yorker earlier this summer, the thing that I heard over and over again from people in the climate world was, I had no idea. I had no idea how fast this was going, but fast it is. May is the last month for which we have good numbers. In May, China was building 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. Now, a gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant. So they were putting up one of those in solar panels every 8 hours, okay? China is, forget petrostates, emerging very fast as the first electrostate that the world has ever seen. In this country, the progress is much spottier, but profound in the places where it's really been tried. Most of all, California, which went to work on this some years ago, not perfectly, but they've done a lot of things right. And as a result, about 18 months ago, California hit a kind of tipping point. Most days now in California, the state produces more than 100% of its electricity from renewable power for long stretches of the day. When the sun goes down at night, the biggest source of supply on the grid in California now are batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon, batteries that did not exist 4 years ago. Bottom line, in California, and this is the most hopeful statistic I've heard in the 4 decades I've been working on the climate crisis, bottom line, California, 4th largest economy on planet Earth, is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than it was 2 years ago. That's a big change. That's the kind of number that spread around the world starts to shave tenths of a degree off how hot this planet gets. And every tenth of a degree that we raise the temperature moves 100 million of our brothers and sisters out of a safe climate zone and into a dangerous one. So we're talking truly, truly crucial possibilities here. In a weird and sort of interesting twist, the state that's replaced California as the fastest growing clean energy state in the country is Texas, which is installing this stuff at an extraordinary pace now, not out of any, I think, great desire to deal with the climate crisis, but out of the sheer economic recognition that this is the most affordable way to produce lots of electricity and to stabilize their heretofore quite unstable grid. You find even more remarkable stories when you look around the rest of the planet. I was talking about Pakistan a minute ago. There's not a country on Earth that's been hit harder by climate change. Not just those massive floods, though they've taken tens of millions of people out of their homes, but also the fact that it now routinely reaches 125, 126 degrees in their urban areas in the summer. But their geography confers one advantage. They have a long border with China. And that means that it was very easy to start importing cheap Chinese solar panels as the Chinese produced a huge flood of them over the last couple of years. So last year, beginning of 2024, people who watch the energy grids around the world were startled to see energy demand on the national grid in China and Pakistan starting to drop. And they couldn't figure out what was going on because our demand for energy never goes down unless COVID. Humans always use more energy, but they weren't, or at least apparently. People figured out what was happening by looking at Google Earth. And if you watched the roof lines of Lahore and Karachi and Islamabad, solar panels were suddenly spreading like mushrooms after the rain, you know? It was extraordinary to see. It was not some government program. It was Pakistanis tired of unreliable and expensive electricity, buying cheap Chinese solar panels, and then going on YouTube to watch videos with Hindustani music in the background where people showed how to kind of hook them together. In 8 months, they built the equivalent of half the country's national electric grid just like that. Pakistani farmers were early adopters because those of you who've traveled in rural Asia know that the soundtrack of that part of the world is the hum and the cough of diesel pumps and generators as they pull up the water through the deep tube wells that are the legacy of the Green Revolution of the 60s. That diesel is often the biggest cost that farmers have, small farmers. So these guys were eager to get solar panels. They usually lacked the money to build the steel supports that we're used to seeing. They just laid them on the ground, pointed them at the sky. Pakistan last year used 35% less diesel fuel than they had the year before. That's now spreading quickly into Africa, along any place that has a kind of Chinese trade route at the moment. This same thing is starting to happen. And of course, in China, it's particularly beautiful because there's 700 million people there still who have no electricity and were, for all intents and purposes, never going to get it. Fossil fuel had 250 years to supply them with power, and it manifestly failed. But now solar is starting to do the job with enormous speed. I tell you all this just to give you a sense of extraordinary possibility, not by any means of any kind of certainty, because we have to move with extraordinary speed if any of this is really going to matter. Absent climate change, we wouldn't have to move with such speed, you know. Absent climate change, I guess we could sit back and let economics more or less take its course. And eventually, within 3 or 4 decades, we'd run the world on sun and wind just because it's cheap, okay? But 3 or 4 decades we do not have. If it takes us anything like that long to get there, then the world that we run on sun and wind will be a broken world. So our job is to figure out how to speed this up. And particularly, that's our job in this country. Because in this country, our leadership has decided, fairly uniquely, that they're going to try and slow it down with everything that they have. And that's been one of the 3 or 4 clear messages of Trumpism over the last 7 or 8 months. I mean, along with, we're going to deport everyone we can, we're going to tariff everything that we can, and we're going to try and destroy this movement towards clean energy as quickly as we can. Doing things that are truthfully almost beyond belief. The news last week that the Trump administration had issued stop work orders on wind farms that were 80 and 90% complete off the coast of New England is just strange beyond all telling. I don't think that I can't think of a analog any place in the history that I can recall. And I was saying to Mike earlier today, Mike Tidwell and I were talking earlier today, I was saying, if it sticks, if they really are able to do this 1,000 years from now, it's going to be a big problem for archaeologists trying to figure out what sort of religious cult had built this series of pylons off the coast and then just abandoned them there for what reason no one could know. In general, I mean, if they have their way, then much shorter order than that, 20, 30 years, they will have succeeded in turning America, where these things were invented, into a kind of colonial Williamsburg of internal combustion, and if they let people get tourist visas anymore, they'll just come here to gawk at how people back in the olden times, powered their lives by setting stuff on fire, So we do not want that to happen.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
Theoretically, truthfully, I'm here on book tour, but I'm also here mostly on sort of organizing tour. And at the moment, we're all prepping really hard for Sunday, which is 11 days out now, right? Yes, September 21st, a week from Sunday. There are hundreds and hundreds of events all over the country. Mike and his friends at CCAN are arranging a EV circling of the White House a couple of days in advance, just to get things up and running. So talk to him. And then there's lots and lots of great stuff going on the 21st. And I think there'll be people to sort of tell you about it and pass some things out and stuff later on. But you can go to sunday.earth also. And so here's what I want to talk about for a few minutes, which is, it's sort of about the possibility of the world on the other side of this. Because there's a series of very pragmatic and utilitarian reasons to do this, having to do with the fact that it would be nice to prevent the climate from collapsing, and the fact that it would save people lots of money. But there are also a kind of broader series of reasons. And as I get at them, let me sort of try and deal a little bit with the sort of objections, I think, that rise in people's minds. Because there is no such thing as a free lunch, but there definitely are less expensive lunches and more expensive lunches, okay? And this one falls in the former category. Yeah, you have to go mine some stuff to let it happen. And we should be as careful and humane in that mining as it's possible to be. But mining's always going to involve gouging things out of the ground, and it's never going to be great. So it behooves us to think about what it is we're digging. Lithium is an important component of the batteries that help make this miracle work, okay? And lithium needs to be mined. But once you've mined it, there it sits in the battery for 20 or 25 years doing its lithium thing. And if the battery eventually degrades, it's valuable enough that we now know how to recycle it and get it back and start over again in the next battery. If you go mine some coal, you set it on fire, and then you have to mine some more the next day, okay? Which is why the Rocky Mountain Institute, our old friend Amory Lovins held shop, put out a report last September saying that the whole mining burden of the battery renewable transition by mid-century would involve a smaller volume of mining than what we did with coal last year on this planet, okay? A way to think about it in your mind, just to get this difference sort of set in your mind, is that a boatload of solar panels delivered someplace and deployed in their lifetime will produce about 500 times as much energy as a boatload of coal, okay? And yeah, it will take some land to do this, a percentage or two of the land surface devoted to producing our energy from sun and wind, which is not a lot more really than we use, at least in the fossil fuel producing nations of the world, for coal and gas and oil, but not nothing. So it's worth thinking about that too. We devote a lot of our landscape to energy already. Corn is the biggest crop in America. We grow 60 million acres of it. 30 million of those are for ethanol. We're growing gasoline. That 30 million acres produces about 3% of all the energy that America uses. The same 30 million acres, if you covered them with solar panels, which is not how we want to do it. We don't want to just take all of Indiana and cover it with solar panels. But if you did, that same 30 million acres would produce more than 100% of the energy that America currently uses. This really was brought home to me last summer. I was doing some reporting for the book in Illinois. It's some of the most fertile topsoil on planet Earth, And there was a farmer there who was in the process of converting some portion of his land to solar power. He said, look, here's an acre. I grow corn. It gets turned into ethanol. That produces enough ethanol to drive my Ford F-150 pickup, most popular vehicle in America, about 25,000 miles. Here's another acre right next to it. I'm going to put it in solar panels. It will produce enough electrons to drive my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the same pickup, not 25,000 miles, but 700,000 miles, okay? That gives you some sense of the efficiency of this stuff. Not only that, you don't have to pour nitrogen and phosphorus on solar panels to make them work. And so there's nothing to wash down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, where it creates a dead zone. You don't have to strafe it with herbicides and pesticides. And if you go look at a solar field, you're only using about half of it for solar panels because there are these big, wide aisles in between them. And those have given rise in the last couple of years to this entire new human discipline that we've never had before that has the awkward name of agrovoltaics, but really is about how you cultivate shade. Solar farm produces shade, which on a overheating planet is a really useful commodity. It helps retain moisture and it allows all kinds of crops not just to grow, but often to grow more bountifully than they've grown before. We just put out a little video yesterday from Sunday that's now been seen, in the way that the world works now 3 or 4 million times on YouTube. And it begins with the premise that good suburban parents may have noticed that the lawn underneath their kids' trampoline is more bountiful than the rest of their lawn. It's greener usually because it's retaining more moisture and it's not subject to the constant photosynthetic attack of the sun. That same thing is true for all kinds of stuff. French vintners were reporting last year that they were getting 60% increase in grape yields in fields with solar panels. Now, I'm a beer guy, so this makes no difference to me. But if there anybody out there who tipples in that way, then good news. But it goes deeper than that. If you think about it, if you live on a planet where a truly important resource is only available in a few places, as fossil fuel is, then the people who control those few places end up with way too much power and wealth, which they almost certainly are, unless they're Norwegian, going to abuse in their course of their look around the world. John D. Rockefeller was the first guy to figure this out, and he became the sort of model of the modern plutocrat. But he was, benign compared to many who followed. Our biggest oil and gas barons in this country in the last decades have been the Koch brothers. they devoted their winnings to eroding the foundations of our democracy. If you wonder why it was so easy for Donald Trump to kick them over, it's because those foundations had been rotted out quite purposefully for many, many years. In Europe, the biggest oil and gas baron is Vladimir Putin. He's currently using his cash on hand to probe the defenses of Poland to see if perhaps they're going to fight back or not, that we're well into the 21st century and talking about who's invading Poland is not a pleasant spot to find ourselves. So do a counter experiment or a sort of mental experiment. Imagine what the geopolitics of planet Earth would have looked like over the last 70 years if oil had been of relatively trivial value. How many wars and coups and assassination attempts and terrorist plots and everything else could have been avoided in that world where people were just able to power their lives with something that they all had close to hand, sun and wind. Wind, of course, just being another form of solar power. The sun heats the earth differentially, producing the winds that move those majestic turbines. That kind of world, look, humans are very good at starting wars, but the person who figures out how to start a war over sunshine is going to be an innovator of a bad sort. We have an extraordinary chance to do some rebalancing here. If you look around the world, when we look often at poor nations, and they're always worried about their balance of payments and their debt crisis, and the IMF is going to come in and structurally adjust them, and on and on and on. The biggest reason in many, many, many of those cases is simply the burden of having to pay someone to deliver the next boatload of oil in order to keep whatever economy they have in motion. The numbers are enormous. India, which is a big and in many ways modern economy, nonetheless has not much fossil fuel. 5% of its GDP is just devoted to paying for imported fuel. Think about the number of schools and hospitals and whatever else you could run. I mean, I live in Vermont, which is about as small a place as you can get in America. We spend $2 billion a year on fossil fuel. And there is no fossil fuel in Vermont. We're just writing checks to Saudi Arabia or, Texas or whatever else. So this is an extraordinary possibility for everybody on Earth, except people who own oil wells. And for them, it's terrifying, which explains the politics of the moment in this country. You'll recall candidate Trump inviting fairly openly the executives of the oil industry to donate $1 billion. It was a sort of Austin Powers, $1 billion to his campaign. And in return, they could do whatever they wanted, basically. And they gave him about $500 million, and that was plenty. Between donations and advertising and lobbying and things in the last election cycle, they're getting all that they could ask for. But the fight is not over, not yet. And that Texas example is a good reminder why. Texas is the headquarters of the world hydrocarbon industry. They should have it easier there than any place else. And indeed, they tried this past year in the Texas state legislature to pass a series of laws that would have really put a crimp into the very rapid expansion of clean energy there. The most prominent of them was a bill that everyone thought was going to pass that was being widely referred to as DEI for natural gas. It would have required anyone building 5 megawatts of solar power to also put up 5 megawatts of natural gas, just to make sure that natural gas didn't become discouraged or unhappy, along the way. But out of the woodwork came lots and lots, especially of rural Texans, saying, guys, this is how we pay for our school system, with our solar farm, with our wind farm. You do not want to do this. And as it turned out, the legislature didn't. They adjourned without doing any of this and got back to their real job of redistricting Texas to, give some more seats to Trump. I got an even better story for you. There's this thing that's happened in the last 3 or 4 years in Europe that we're calling balcony solar. This is for people who don't have roofs, who live in apartments. They go to whatever you call Best Buy in Brussels and plunk down a few €100 and return home with a solar panel designed not to be put on the roof, but just to be hung over the railing of your balcony. And out the back is a completely standard plug that you just plug into the wall. You don't need an electrician. You don't have to rewire anything. In many cases, it's providing 20%, 25% of the power that homes are using. That's illegal everywhere in our country, except the progressive bastion of Utah. In the Deseret State earlier this year, a Republican state senator, which I think is the only kind they have, got up and said, if this is good enough for the people of Stuttgart, it's definitely good enough for the people of Provo. We want this too. And by unanimous vote, both houses of the state legislature passed this enabling legislation. And now if you go on YouTube, you can see lots of videos of happy Utahns sticking up their balcony solar. This is one of the tasks that we have to accomplish on Sunday, okay? We're gonna be pushing around the country, not only for that balcony solar stuff in city after city, and Mike assures me that there are gonna be bills in all the relevant state houses in this part of the world to accomplish this, and I have no doubt that the hardworking third act crew will make sure that their legislators have no peace until it is, achieved. We're also going to be pushing everywhere for much easier permitting for rooftop solar. We can't do anything right now in Congress. I was up in Congress today. My, what a discouraged bunch of people our congressmen are at the moment. But we can't do anything there, but we can do plenty back in city halls and state houses. It costs 4 times as much to put solar on your roof here as it does in Australia or the EU. Tiny bit of that is the tariff on solar panels. Mostly it's because we have 15,000 municipalities in this country. Every one of them has their own building code and their own team of inspectors, and it takes months often to get this done. In most of the world, if you want solar panel on your roof, you call somebody up on Monday, and by Friday it's pumping out power, We can do that kind of thing here too, or at least we could once upon a time. There's an app. There's always an app, but this one comes from the National Renewable Energy Lab. It's called Solar App Plus. It allows a contractor to plug in what equipment he's putting on what address, and if the database says that's okay, then they get an instant permit. This is now the law in the state of Maryland, and also in the state of California, and it's through both houses of the legislature in New Jersey awaiting the governor's signature, but we need it everywhere, and we need to be, especially without the money in the IRA, we need to be driving down quickly the cost of doing this, because it's completely necessary, and also because it's kind of beautiful. Beauty is an more important part of human affairs than sometimes we give it credit for. I was thinking of that reading Mike's great recent book set in Tacoma Park, The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue, which is all about the loss of the beauty of those great trees in a fast heating planet.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
You know, I obviously stole the title for this book from George Harrison. And then I went to Spotify to check things out, and it turns out that Here Comes the Sun is by far the most streamed song in the Beatles' vast catalog. Twice as many people every day listen to it as Hey Jude or Let It Be or anything else. I think because in a dark moment, its kind of gentle and optimistic nature is appreciated. And I think because humans actually have a really deep connection to the sun. It is the most charismatic object in our corner of the galaxy, you know. It already gives us heat and light and via photosynthesis our supper. And now it's willing to provide us with all the power we could ever want. But in such a gorgeous way. I mean, exists there a human who doesn't grin when the sun comes out from behind a cloud and hits them in the shoulders, you know? I really sort of got started thinking about this book about 18 months ago. Up in Vermont, we had a total eclipse. And it was the biggest thing that had ever happened, with biggest traffic jams in the history of Vermont as people flooded in. But they were very merry traffic jams, everybody in a good mood because it was so beautiful. I was on the quad at Middlebury College, 1,500 students, all of whom put their phones down for a good hour, you know, and just watched this spectacle play out. And just the idea that we could figure out a kind of new way to order the world around us that was less, I mean, Donald Trump keeps talking about energy dominance. That's his thing. And that just sounds like the ugliest idea in every possible way. Instead, this idea of just of energy flowing on. Now, I don't mean to be big hippie here, and I've lived my life on dirt roads in rural America, some of it in blue state Vermont, but a lot of it in red state parts of America. And I have lots of neighbors with Trump flags and things, and a lot of them have solar panels too, for entirely different reasons. Their home is their castle, and by God, they're going to have an independent power supply for it, and that's fine. You know what? I'm enough of an American that I kind of feel sometimes like my home is my castle too. So, I get that. That makes sense to me. But the idea that we could live on that kind of world, I had the great good fortune to have my first grandchild about 18 months ago, who this book is dedicated to. So I now know and dearly love someone who's going to be around in the 22nd century. And in certain ways, the 22nd century is not looking so good, right now. But maybe it could. I think this is the single most important thing we could do in short order to give that century a chance of being something other than dismal, maybe something quite beautiful. So there I end. Thank you very much for bearing with me. And Brad tells me that the local custom, if you want to question or critique or abuse or whatever, is to line up behind this microphone over here by the pillar, yes? So Mike Tidwell, you get first crack.
Yeah, Mike Tidwell, Director of Chesapeake Climate Action Network. And yes, we are We have a lot planned for September 21, starting with a curtain raiser on the 19th of September, Friday, in front of Congress, an electric vehicle rally. And then we got lots of activities in DC, Northern Virginia, Maryland. Go to ChesapeakeClimate.org or go to Sunday.earth, and you can see all the activities across the country. Bill, I have read all your books. They've changed my life. They made me a climate activist. But it seems like in all your books prior to this one, you were always pointing to solutions that could be or might be or just over the horizon. In this book, you're pointing to things that are already happening in terms of solar. When you wrote The End of Nature, you say you were a sad young man writing that book. With this book, are you less sad?
Look, I mean, it is a sad moment in lots of ways, and we've endured an enormous amount of loss already on this planet, and we're going to endure a lot more. There's no getting around a lot of that. Events are in motion, in train. We've done damage, and it's going to keep ramifying. So, but for the first time, it feels like we have something scalable that we can do. We've spent 30 years, you spent 30 years, lots of people working, on all of this, basically in a world in which fossil fuel was cheap and renewable energy was expensive. Our job in many ways was to try and make fossil fuel more expensive. Carbon taxes, divestment to raise their cost of capital, stopping new pipeline projects to keep them from consolidating whatever, wherever they could, things like that. Now we live as of 5 years ago or so, on a world where the cheapest way to make power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And that's a completely epochal moment. I mean, it's a real change in the foundation of things that opens up deep, deep possibilities. So I am maybe a little less sad, but I remain, perhaps just congenitally, deeply anxious, because it would be an enormous sadness to blow this chance, to get given a kind of way out and not rush down it just as fast as we could.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is about the climate conferences world, which unfortunately we are no longer a part of. But one of the main stumbling blocks is they're always squabbling about how much the rich country, the global north, should fund some of the global south.
Yep.
And taking the cue from what you said about so many million hectares of solar panels can provide electricity for the whole USA. Do you think one of the things they should be doing instead of fighting is just specify, okay, this country, you go and spend, 10 million acres and we'll give you half the money.
Absolutely. I think this is actually, I just wrote a piece about this about 10 days ago, just saying in a rational world, what we, instead of continuing to have this endless parade of climate meetings around the world that really have sort of turned into talk shops at this point. Their high water mark was Paris, and that was very useful. But since then, we've accomplished not much. It would be, in a smart world, we would be globalizing the Chinese solar panel factories that are capable of producing many more panels than they currently are. The Chinese are actually trying to shut in production some to raise the price some. Instead, we should all be paying to run those 24/7, and probably we should just be filling boats full of solar panels and dropping them off on every wharf and railroad siding on the planet, and let people a la Pakistan come and take them away and put them together and see what happens in the course of a few years. We're not going to do that, but we should be doing something sort of like you recommend. I will say, I think it's possible that, though lamentable and immoral, the absence of the U.S. from international climate negotiations may actually make those climate negotiations easier. Our political dysfunction has plagued this system from the start. The reason that there's never been a global climate treaty, after no attempt to do one after Kyoto, was because the rest of the world came to the realization that there would never be 67 senators in the US Senate willing to adopt a climate treaty. So they just dropped work on it and started building this kind of series of weird jury-rigged pledges and things that marked the Paris Agreement. Now our political dysfunction has reached the point that we're not going to even take part in anything. So maybe that will open up a lane, and I think the Chinese are going to seize that lane. This is probably their path to a kind of global political legitimacy. And I have many problems with the system in China. I'm well aware that if I had spent my life doing in China what I did in America, I would have been rotting in prison long ago. But I think in this case, they're probably more likely to behave responsibly than we are at this juncture in our political lives.
Thank you.
Thanks for a fantastic talk, and I'm sure it's a fantastic book. My name is Caroline Pomplin. I was a staff attorney at EPA until 1986, when I quit in disgust and went to medical school. My question is, there are 30% of the population here. There was a time when climate change was something you read about in books. Now it's on television every night. The fires in California, in the Northwest, in northern Canada, huge floods in Texas, Florida, the hurricanes are bigger than ever. There are 30% of the voting population here who don't believe in climate change. And my question is, why? What is it?
30% of people don't believe in climate change, and why? Our information systems in this country are kind of broken. I'll tell you a story. I was researching all of this. I spent a day looking at all the coverage from 1954 of the day that the first solar cell was announced at Bell Labs in New Jersey. There's a big story on the front page of the Times. It was a good story. It was like, device made of sand will harness power of sun and whatever. But you know what it was next to was right on the front page, the next story to it was an account of the first large-scale polio vaccinations in the country. So,
I remember it well.
Pretty hard to argue that we're getting wiser in this country as time goes on. It's kind of painful to watch, where we are. I guess the good news is that it's only 30%, and that leaves 70% of people to work with, and that should be enough to get. We're going to really have to hope and work extremely hard to reconstitute a bare majority of rational and kind people in this country in the hopes that we can win the next series of elections and have some hope of restoring something, some version of the world we once knew. But it won't be the same world, and perhaps it shouldn't be quite the same world. If we ever do get back to operating something like normal, it'll probably be a relief, for instance, that the US will no longer be the dominant country in the world. Those days are gone for good. We're going to have to be a large Belgium that works with others, and figures out how to make things happen. So, yes, your question is a good one, and I have no great answer, except to say this is why we organize. The reason that we're doing Sunday, above all, is to spread the news that we are no longer to think of this as alternative energy. We need to get it out of that marginalized place where it's lived for 40 years in our brains and educate each other that it's now the common sense, straightforward, obvious way to power the planet. The shorthand that I've been using is we've spent a long time thinking of sun and wind as the whole foods of energy. Nice, but kind of pricey and for special people. It's not. It's the Costco of energy. It's cheap. You can buy it in bulk. It's on the shelf, ready to go. So that's the educational message to get across to your friends and neighbors.
From your lips to God's ear.
There we go.
Hi. Thank you for your dedication for a long time. The message I hear you giving tonight is about controlling the generation of emissions so we don't add to the concentration that's already in the atmosphere. But about 5 years ago, I sat down and tried to define what actually the climate problem is. And where we've looked at it and all the mechanisms we've tried to adopt is we've treated it as an emissions problem, when in fact the climate problem is a concentration problem. So where we are now, we've blown past the time when we could prevent a climate catastrophe by just controlling emissions because there's so much already in the atmosphere. So I've looked at what mechanisms people might use to address the concentration, and I did a paper, and what I found out is that addressing the concentration is a question that's sort of a taboo. Nobody wants to get to that because what you would have to do is find some means of taxing emissions that are already in the atmosphere. That like Superfund, for example, you would go back and say you put it in the atmosphere, okay, it has a cost, now you pay the cost. It was before, but now you pay. So question one is, I probably don't know of everything going on, so maybe you can tell me what's going on with regulatory mechanisms that are meant to address the concentration problem, which is part of the problem, of course, and also why people think of it as a taboo.
Well, so first of all, I don't really think of it as a taboo. I started a global organization called 350.org that was all about the parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's obviously at the heart of the problem. It's just very hard to get CO2 out of the air once it's there. And the reason that it's hard is because it's now dispersed in parts per million. And the physical task of going out and finding those parts per million molecules, separating them from the rest of the air, and it takes extraordinary amounts of energy/money to make happen. So one of the reasons that we focus a lot on emissions right now is we don't want to put more out there that we're going to have to go take out soon. At the moment anyway, this is by far the most cost-effective way of keeping the problem in some degree manageable. The machines that are best at taking carbon out of the atmosphere, obviously, are trees and plankton. And left to their own devices, they'll actually do a fair job of this over time if we stop putting more in. They won't do it quickly enough to get rid of the problem. You're correct. And Mike actually in this book talks a fair amount about some of the possibilities for carbon dioxide removal. But do not, the oft-used and correct analogy is if you walk into a bathroom and there is water pouring out of the bathtub onto the floor, yes, at a certain point you're going to have to figure out how to, scoop up the water on the floor, but you'd be an idiot if you didn't first go and turn the tap off, That's how all people would react, and solar and wind energy is the way that we have of turning off the tap. And, then we will do what we can to get stuff out of the air, but it is a hard physical task. That's just physics.
Well, let me just add one final thing, and that is if you tax previous emissions,
retroactive liability, and then you say, dear ExxonMobil, you can either pay the tax or you can devote money towards some sort of mechanism to pull it out.
Fair
you can
enough.
bet they would put
Fair
the
enough.
resources towards the latter option.
I'll just add that if taking carbon out of the air is a hard physical task, taxing Exxon is a hard political task. So don't,
Yes, thank you.
Let's also build a few solar panels along the way.
Hi, okay, so I'm from Leisure World, and I recently went to a talk by a Maryland state senator who talked about the growing energy crisis in Maryland and talked about massive increases in electric costs and blackouts.
Yes.
So, and the reason why he said is because we haven't kept up on developing enough energy.
Yes.
So that Maryland only produces like 40% of its energy.
Yes.
But really, from what I've kind of done on research, is the problem is you have all these tech companies going into Pennsylvania, who is the largest producer of natural gas, and getting scooping up all the energy from Pennsylvania and settling out there, and kind of scooping up all the energy. So my question is. And then we even got a kind of a note that they're going to be raising the gas prices,
Yep.
JPM, by 15 to 20%.
Yep.
My problem is they sit down and say, anytime we talk to the people there, it's that solar's not there.
Yes. So this is the way to answer that question. Okay. It's a very important one, and it's happening all over the world. I'm not going to answer it re-Pennsylvania for you because I don't know the details, but
Yeah.
the way to think about it in this country right now, electricity prices are up so far about 10% already this year and rising, all right? This is what happens when you increase demand by building lots of data centers and things. We can have a debate about whether that's a good idea or not, but it's happening, all right? And at the same time, you constrict the supply of the cheapest and fastest stuff to build. I am not a PhD economist, but you don't need to be one to know that when you increase demand and constrict supply, price rises rapidly. It is very important over the next 14 months to wrap this around the necks of every Republican office holder who has gone along with the plan to constrict the supply of cheap energy. If you think that it's absolutely crucial to build a lot of data centers very quickly to allow AI to become whatever thing it is decided it must become in its, in its ineffable conception of itself. The only way to produce enough energy to do that is to build lots of solar farms and windmills because nothing else goes up fast. You can't buy a gas turbine between now and 2030. They're on back order, okay? But you can build a solar farm in 6 weeks. I mean, that's how long it takes. So
Or even we have problems just even talking like, for the property that, there's lots of car parking lots where you
Yes.
could kind of sit down and do solar, but everyone they even said that the mandates that solar or that renewable energy costs more. So
all I can tell you is it doesn't cost more, but you're going to have to get some new people to talk to. And
Yes.
that's the reason we have elections, so that we can get some new people to talk to.
Yeah.
Good questions.
Hey, Bill, there's just time for like one or two more questions.
All right, one more question, absolutely.
Oh, man, just under the
Yes, a
wire.
lot of pressure now.
That's a lot of pressure. But for me, there's a couple of hundred of us here. There's only one really important question is what can we do? So to enhance what you're talking about. So I retired recently. I have more time to be politically active, but I have a very pedestrian question. With the disposable cash I have, I just bought your book, but but with the rest of
That's really the only thing you have to do.
should I just keep buying more copies? No.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I'm actually asking for some practical,
Yeah,
perhaps
I'm gonna tell you
inappropriate
some.
advice. What should I do with the money that I have to donate?
Oh, so I'm not gonna, the money you have to donate, I mean, we can find lots of uses for it and whatever. But really, what we need is, you said you'd recently retired.
Yes.
What we need is your time and your brain. Bob and many other people here at Third Act, on the off chance that there are, I mean, it was nice of you to give me my next assignment, Fourth Act, for the, the people over 80. But actually, Third Act, in the last 3 years, we've grown, if there's anybody here over 60, we've grown this very fast. There's now 100,000 people across the country, and they are doing unbelievably good work. Right now, focused very hard on Sunday, but as soon as Sunday is over, back focused on all the other things that we do, which include many of the very mundane chores of taking on these questions. One of the things, I spent most of my life organizing young people, which was great, but people stay young for such a little time, They grow up and get busy and whatever. Now we found that when you organize like a 62-year-old, they're good for a quarter century, and we're able to do really boring work. One of the things we've specialized in, and it's really important, every state has something called a Public Utility Commission or a Public Service Commission. They're incredibly important. That's where all sorts of these decisions get made. They are protected by a force field of their own dullness. The only people who go to the meetings are utility lobbyists who capture them. But now we have an army of people who appear with their basket of crocheting or their crossword puzzle book or whatever it is, and sit there and witness the proceedings, testify, organize, become experts, change policy in profound and deep ways. So the Third Act could definitely use your money, but it could really use your brain.
Okay, I pledge that my body and brain will join
you go.
Third Act. But I've done other things, but I actually was only dimly aware of Third Act, and I will join Third Act and put time into it. But I don't want you to dodge the question. Okay. I mean, is Third Act, I'm looking for, you have expertise. What's the most efficient way?
So I would just say, when it comes to this, to all these questions, there are lots of things we can do individually, and they're really important in this case. I mean, you should get solar panels on your roof, and you should do it before the end of the year, because then you'll get the 30% tax credit, on and on. But as always, my mantra is the same. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to put pressure on the system. We don't have the money, the billions upon billions of dollars that the other side in this fight has. So we have to make use of the human capital that comes from the talent and the passion and the hard work of people working together. That's why we started 350.org and Third Act, and why Mike has CCAN going, and why we have the Sierra Club, every possible thing that there is. Dig in. The drama here is very real. The month that the temperature set in June of 2023, set the first of this set of new all-time records, when climatologists were saying this is the hottest temperature we've had in 125,000 years. That month, June 2023, was also the same month when humans started putting up more than 1 gigawatt's worth of solar panels every day. This is a race. The cavalry has appeared, but now the cavalry has to ride really hard. So let's get to it. See you on Sunday.
If you like hearing nonfiction authors talk about their work, you should check out our America's Book Club podcast. Every week, author and philanthropist David Rubenstein talks with leading authors and cultural figures about their ideas and works. Find America's Book Club wherever you get your podcasts.